Hi, everyone. This is my first live. I'm Stephanie Gerber Wilson, and this is Freedom Over Fascism. And I am joined today by Anne Christine Dedesky, who is a writer, a journalist, and an author. And I wanted to talk today about humor in resistance and opposition. But I wonder, will you first introduce yourself for the folks who don't know you?
Of course. Good morning. Well, I mean, it's actually good afternoon. Um, mm, so first, I just want to add, I'm also a very long time activist, and I have been both engaged in and studying sort of nonviolent organizing. And I think I'm probably far more interested in what works than what doesn't work than most of the people who study this.
Hmm.
But it's because I've had a lot of really positive experiences of observing what does work also. So that I think gives me a different perspective than a lot of other people. Anyway, so yeah, I'm a very long time journalist and writer, and I live in New York City. My current activity is that I started a campaign, kind of a reporting platform, uh, and it was in the fall of 2023. Um, I had just been thinking about focusing a lot on the criminalization of gender in Africa, and as people probably know, there was a lot that was happening then when I came across Project 2025. So I immediately called people thinking, where have I been? Why don't I know about this? And I found that nobody in my community, which is a very engaged activist community, and a lot of independent journalists, knew about this at all, which was shocking to me. Without much, delay, I held some kind of meetings for colleagues and things, and decided to throw a town hall in New York City, and we started there and launched this project called for the all of 2024. It's called Stop the Coup 2025. And so really what we focused on was just really sounding the alarm and breaking down Project 2025 to make it really digestible for people to understand rather than like how we interpreted it. We really just presented like what were they saying so people because they could look at it anyway to really make
Right.
sure people understood. And then we also created some tools, including a toolkit for community organizers that got used quite a bit. And then when sort of the focus started turning to the elections, we were able to work with about a couple of hundred volunteers around the country, actually, and we really focused from the beginning on putting tools into the hands of community organizers. Since we're a small group, we really hadn't money, and so that really has been our approach, and it was very successful. We reached millions of people. I'm very happy to say. And then when Trump was elected, of course, we didn't stop him, but we did a lot. I think collectively, people did a lot. So we focused on resistance. And so since that time, we shifted our focus. The platform is called Resisting Project 2025. And we also have started this Substack, which we launched right around or a couple of days maybe after elections, but really took off with the inauguration. And we do a biweekly Substack, and we focus on really covering the resistance that's emerging. But also for me, I'm really focused more than anything else on kind of ideas at work, and I also am steadily, although I don't do this all the time, giving people a yardstick of how far along we've come with Project 2025's implementation. So I'll just stop there.
Um, well, let me ask you this. How far have we come with the
I
implement?
don't yeah, I have to I could probably give you the answer tomorrow. I've been looking at other people's yardstick. I think that we are further along than people are assessing. Ms. Magazine did an assessment recently that where they were 40% along. Some people have thrown out bigger numbers. But what I would say is that we're very far along with the first piece of it, which was what the people who did Project 25, for people who don't know about this, maybe who are watching Project 2025 is a policy kind of it has three parts of it. One part of it was this big policy blueprint. The second part of it was essentially recruiting, vetting, and training something like they wanted initially 20,000 potentially kind of Christian conservatives to be able to come in and step into a new government. And part of it was also getting rid of all the top echelons of the existing government, taking apart the government in order to be able to essentially put in place a kind of army of loyalists that are really loyal more to the executive branch, not just Trump, but the executive branch. And then there are other pieces of that. Um, and the pieces that I think we haven't seen so much yet are really the more intensive advancement of the Christian theocracy, which is within all this. We're just starting to see it I think a couple of pieces we've seen, like they recently passed and it was by executive order, a statement saying that there could be no anti-Christian bias within the
Right.
federal government language. We're starting to see it within things around, whether it's the reproductive health agenda, the LGBT agenda, et cetera. But there is a much more ambitious agenda there. So I think that is still to come. And then there's also a lot of different pieces that are much further around privatization and deregulation that we've seen yet. They're getting to it. And I think the other thing that we're not seeing is that a lot of the model for this is the idea that you're taking apart the federal government and then to some extent you're punting a lot of things to the states. And so on a positive side, that's where we actually have some possibilities of real resistance because even though the elections went not the way progressives wanted, obviously Trump won, and a lot of conservatives also won different elections. If you look at the state level, a lot of Democrats won, especially at the state and local levels, so that there may be much more pushback that can be done. So, for example, if you look at something like Medicaid, these things where you take a federal program, but then it's being administered by the states. There are a lot of places where state laws may actually trump, excuse me, language, may actually overcome a federal law.
Right.
So just to say that, I look at it in these ways of just saying, where are there avenues? And then the other thing that I learned a lot, and I think is critical for people to focus on now, is in other movements, even in the US, really sort of, before and after the Vietnam War, one of the things that is very important is to focus on like where the fractures are happening on the other side and whether you can take advantage of those. And we're seeing that the Trump administration is making huge mistakes. They're overreaching. We're seeing this, and the best example I can give you is at the FAA right now, where, because they fired so many people and they took away a lot of infrastructure from an already weakened thing. Their
Mhm.
goal is to say if we take money away and we show how bad the government is and how poorly it functions, it makes it easier for us to make an argument that we take it over and privatize it and we do all of the human stuff with bots. That's the model that they want. But in fact, we can show that this was very much you know, a direct result of these policies. And what is the human cost? So when you make human cost arguments, what I have seen looking at movements is that that goes very far. So we have a lot of places where we can make advances. Yeah.
Um, so, 2 requests for anybody who's here. If you can please press the little heart, it helps with the algorithm, I've heard. And many of you know that I've been talking a lot with Andrew Watkins, who has come at this Project 2025 piece from the Christian conservative angle. She grew up there, so she's been sort of parsing that over time. The piece that I'm really interested right now is we've got this opposition that's sort of coalescing. It's in a lot of different places, but not really fully together yet. And I read your piece on using humor
Mhm.
and what can be done with humor in, in terms of like getting people um, activated and making a difference in the way that people feel. So, and I also know that humor can be overused and if you try too much to focus on the buffoonery of, say, Trump, his thighs, his golf, his dementia, it can backfire. So, what do you think is, or what have been some of the more successful uses of humor in opposing autocratic regimes?
Mhm.
And where do you see that um, that could be helpful here?
Well, there are many, many examples, but just to say, you're right that you have to be very careful with humor in the sense that usually what works is it doesn't always work well to deny other people's values or experiences. So it can really not work to make fun of a Trump or maybe even make fun of a MAGA person if you're seeking to do something that you wouldn't want necessarily done to yourself, right? Where I think humor works really well is when it speaks to it's disarming. It can make people laugh, particularly in any area where things are frightening. Humor can really allow people to regain a sense of control and perspective. And the things about autocrats that is really a truism is that more than anything else, what authoritarian regimes or autocrats want to do is they want to make you afraid, and that will make you obey.
Right.
So there are millions of kinds of acts of defiance or disobedience that can be very small that essentially chip away at that kind of facade of power and that sovereignty. And so that's the first good news that there's a million things you can do. And at a million levels, and it actually really helps to do it in the smaller levels rather than always going for the giant gestures. Um, but I'll give you some examples. I mean, I just pulled some. I was looking at a book. I think I might have mentioned this one book that it's a nice one. It's an early primer for people. I think it's called something like Blueprint for a Revolution, and it was done
Mhm.
by one of the Serbian youth movement people of Otpor. That was their youth movement in the 90s. It was very successful. He gives bunches of examples. I just pulled a few, but I also have my own. But one example, for example, it's very useful to take specific things rather than go broad for everything you want. Like maybe like ultimately democracy is the thing we're trying to uphold. Speaks to our values. So as much as we can express democracy in whatever we do, that's very good. But I'll give you some examples. So I'm watching right now an organization that's in Boston, and they're doing something that's been done by a lot of groups quite successfully. And it's basically reclaiming public squares and spaces where we may not be able to reclaim them in an environment where maybe there's more repression. So there's a group called Silence Do Good, and they have been projecting essentially almost statements from the early Constitution in a place in Boston. And they're doing it on all of the public buildings that really symbolize our early constitutional institutions and structures in Boston. I don't have the quote in front of me, but it's things like, in the face of tyranny, blah, blah. And what's
Well,
great is that,
I will tell you that I live in Lexington, Massachusetts,
yeah,
and,
yeah,
we've rev people in town have revived the idea of Lexington Alarm, which was the group that, uh, kind of pulled out the Minutemen, and they made these posters that they quickly ran out of using that old font, "No Kings,"
right,
and there was a Patrick Henry,
right,
quote, and that's on many, many, many of the
right.
houses in
Right.
town. So
Basically, no
uh,
one can miss it. Like if you're in a public square, it's an easy way to do something. It doesn't cost any money. You don't have to ask for any permits, and it can be adapted in so many ways. So that's already a great one. So in terms of a visibility action, you kind of what you're doing is you're doing two things. You're reminding people of what you stand for collectively. You're
mhm.
reclaiming your commons, right? And you're making a statement that everyone is going to understand as a critique of maybe an autocrat or authoritarian regime. So those kind of actions are always very successful. Um, I was reminded of one when Harvey Milk first started his campaigns. He was kind of working in a small shop, wasn't really known, and there was just incredible amount of homophobia at the time. And he was kind of living in a little bubble of, what was considered to some extent to be this gay ghetto almost in that period of time. Um, and he was going door to door knocking and realizing that you know, what you kinda have to do is you can do a small action, but you always have to think about who is it that you wanna have on your side with you, like, who is with you? And so he realized that one of the he kinda took the temperature of what people cared about because he was really going to try to become, like, ultimately what he became, which is like the mayor of the Castro and then, mayor. And he realized that people were really unhappy with the amount of dog shit that there was in San Francisco being left on sidewalks.
Right.
So he ended up doing something with local TV where he could have accidentally, but it was planned, stepped in some dog shit. And basically talked about, like, we really need to clean up our city. Okay, that got an enormous amount of play. That got him an automatic sympathy. He didn't talk about gay rights. He didn't talk about whatever, the issues what his enemies were seeking to do, which was connect him to this kind of, maybe identity or gender or sexuality that was seen as, not the norm. And he chose these things that basically got him a lot of allies and then at some point, he introduced other things that had to do with a set of values by essentially claiming these are our values. That was very successful for him.
Mhm.
That's a kind of classic, what a lot of people do when they're becoming local politicians and things, but it works. And he did it through humor
Mhm.
because everyone, recognized that he was doing this, but it just delivered the message easily. So visuals, easy messages. There was one that I really loved. In Damascus, they were dealing with the Assad regime, which, it didn't fall then and it took a long time. But at some point, it was done in a couple of places where they realized that they didn't have places where they could easily speak out. People were really like being arrested, being thrown in jail, etc. And what they ended up doing was printing some messages about the regime on ping pong balls, and they started distributing them. And they distributed them in areas where, if you look in the cities, like it's like in Istanbul, where there's a lot of steps going down. So if you're walking around the city, you got to navigate stairs, right? Especially around public markets. And they did this so that people had to pick up the balls in order to be able to get by. And eventually, to the point where the regime started basically implementing rules against the ping pong balls, not even against the people or the messages, saying, we can't have these things in the street. And so what they would do is they would put all these ping pong balls out. The security people would start to come to pick up all the ping balls. They would videotape people and the absurdity of these people trying to pick up ping pong balls as people are looking at them and throwing them. And then it became a game.
Mhm.
So it became a game. And so who doesn't play a game? Everyone. Because playing a game lets you, again, put the levity in it, say, I'm not going to be afraid of you. And it was incredibly successful for delivering a message that involved these people without asking them to be involved. People just picked it up and began to play that game.
Right.
I mean, it was incredibly successful for that period of time and for that action. Um, there was another one that was done also, I think, where they ended up deciding that there was a ban on music that was done.
Mhm.
And, this is happening in a lot of places where you see, particularly in religiously orthodox or very, very extreme places where they're trying to ban aspects of culture. Music is seen as somehow, a liberal agenda that is going to make people, lose their shit and become sexually active, the minute they hear music or whatever it is. So what they did was they took hundreds of speakers on little USBs and they put them around the city in things that really smelled bad, where you didn't wanna put your hands, like garbage, things like that. And so and then they would turn them on, and you would start hearing music. And, the regime was losing its shit. It was
Right.
fantastic. These are fantastic actions that you can do. I mean, it takes a little organizing, but they're inexpensive. Okay, so these are good examples of when someone is trying to take a space away from you, how can you reclaim it without putting yourself at risk? Because
Right.
both are really necessary. Um, let's see some other examples.
You mentioned something about, like, these, color smoke bombs.
Yeah, so
Uh
that was very recent. So, I mean, basically, you recently had a situation where, uh, in Hungary, Orban has been, he's been in power for, I think it's now 14 years. For those of you who don't know, Viktor Orban, he's an autocrat. He was elected, but, he basically created he did kind of a version of what is happening now with Trump, which is what we call a self coup. A
Mhm.
self coup is when someone gets elected, but then they begin to usurp power from Congress and also from the courts and consolidates into essentially an authoritarian. So that's what we have here. And so what happened under Orban is, I mean, a lot of different things he did, but he has effectively been able to really take over many of the institutions. And the biggest emphasis he's done is he's taken over the media. He's really engaged heavily in propaganda. And importantly, for people listening, the Orban model is in many ways the model for Project 2025, to the point where in the 2 or 3 years before Project 2025 happened, people who are the key people in his cabinet went to Hungary and met with them and studied how they could do this. They
Right.
literally studied this, and then they had institutions that are connected to Orban, that are think tanks, who came over and literally wrote contracts and helped to create this. So we have to understand that the model for Project 2025 is very much based on aspects of the Hungary model, of course, adapted to US, right? But one of the things that happened is that as a result of all of this, Hungary very quickly lost its freedoms, to the point where people really couldn't speak out very well. There was incredible repression. People were afraid, all the things that could potentially happen here. And so what they realized very quickly, and what we are already realizing here in a matter of 3 months, is that in many ways, Hungarians had kind of given up the idea of defending their democracy or defending civics or teaching civics to their own populace. And they began to do that under Orban while it was repressive. They began to do it in a very local way over the years to the point where they built up an opposition. And a few months ago, with elections are happening next year, the opposition was polling higher than Orban very recently. And they had, in fact, the biggest demonstrations they've yet had pretty recently. Really a show of what we call people power, populism, like we're seeing here, where like people are showing that they're upset. It's a mass mobilization, which doesn't necessarily mean a mass organization, right? But it's a mass mobilization. So what happened was the very next day, Orban said, okay, I am going to outlaw Pride and I'm going to outlaw any foreign groups that, are the ones responsible for promoting this agenda of liberalism. And we're going to pass this law. So in fact, they have passed that law. So they didn't stop him from passing the law. But when they went to do this for the first time, they had a minority of the opposition, and the opposition lawmakers were the ones who released these rainbow-colored smoke bombs in the parliament, just completely disrupting the proceedings. They were not able to stop the vote, and they had a majority of Orban people already in it, like we have with the GOP, like a majority was there. But what they did was they created a kind of chaos, and they, one, got all the headlines,
Right.
two, reframed the narrative, and they had hundreds of people on the outside that were gay people and other people. And for the first time, they had many people who were not identified necessarily with the LGBTQ movement because they recognized that this was an attempt to stop their democracy.
Right.
So these are very effective, and you have to build toward it. But did they have people arrested? Yeah, I don't think that they stayed for very long in the, they didn't. No one got put away forever or torture or anything like that. And they won what we call in the court of public opinion, which is where Orban is most upset because he's seeing his strength fall.
Right.
So these are examples of things we can do. There are many, many others. But one I had one today. Like, I'm not going to unfortunately be able to be here for July, I think it's June. I don't remember what the next day is. I think we were thinking about July 4th. But anyway, but I thought to myself, if I was in charge of organizing, which of course I could always try to do or organize something, I would consider a Penguin Brigade to try to either march with the major military parade and get right out in front of it.
That's June 14th.
Or have, a counter large march, or ask, people around the country, everyone, to basically be in a Penguin Brigade and basically say that, what we're doing is we hope to, take over the United States on the part of the Greenland Penguins. It's humor to demonstrate that it's absurd. We all understand how everyone understands it's absurd that this guy is giving himself a military parade. The emperor has no clothes. We know that. And so while I think it's fine that everyone will do the traditional marches and demonstrations and hold the signs and all the things, in a way, I would rather make a funny comment that will make the point in a minute. And if we had, thousands and thousands of penguins, I think, one, it would deliver a message to the world. Two, it would just take the air out of the military parade.
Right.
And it would be incredibly fun. But, it takes a minute to organize those things, and we only have like 2 weeks. But I'm just saying that to me would be a good example of where you're seeking, like, what is the ultimate message you're trying to deliver? You're trying to deliver the fact that, that him trying to show us the military force that he has and how powerful he is does not impress us.
Right.
And we can deliver that message as, to everyone. So that's a good example to me.
You answered my question before I was going to ask it. I was going to ask, what imagery. I mean, one of the things that we have trouble with is how do we break through this media ecosystem that the right has spent decades buying and building. And then there's, the way that we talk about things, which I talk about a lot here. But visually, we haven't figured that out yet. The Tesla takedowns are great. these small local, gatherings are great. What's going on in Massachusetts, fine. But like, I was thinking, what something like the Penguins is brilliant because, military parades, everybody's like walking in unison and like,
Oh, it could be so amazing. If we had had time to do this and then we could have choreographed it and we could have done, all sorts of things, but it takes it takes a lot of people to do that. But, we have 3 years if he's there for 3 years, we have 3 years ahead of us to do some phenomenal ones. But things like that where, it's important to think about your target. Your target is a court of public opinion. You're not gonna stop the military parade from happening, nor do you need to. You have to remember that so many people who are in the army have zero interest in being in those parades themselves. They know that their rights are being and their, stuff is being slashed. And also, rather than trying to kind of, tilt yourself at something that a power structure that you're not interested in, that you don't want to give it any more air, you're taking the air from it. So it's, things like that are easy. And again, numbers do matter, but numbers don't always matter. I mean, you could also do something like, do a march of 60 or 80 penguins with some people, make a film of it, and then project that on a building in Washington. I mean, there's lots of ways to think about amplification. And with social media and media, it's been very successful. I mean, the Tesla takedowns have been successful, but the place they've been the most successful is that people have just taken that and gone to town. I mean, thousands of tunes and cartoons and examples of people, and then even, the ones that I've loved where, as people probably know listening to you maybe, the back of the Tesla is almost like a screen, right? It's a smart car. So
Mhm.
they use that smart car because you can project messages on it.
Right.
And so you just project a message. And so all these Tesla cars around towns are driving saying different things like, the man who invented this is an idiot or whatever they're going to say.
Right.
It's a smart use. And there's other ones, but I think that people who have been using media creatively are quite right to see that, like, if they want to have a greater impact, working with social media that's an already existing infrastructure for communication is good. I think the most important thing, though, is to also recognize that the messenger is important. And so, one thing I've been thinking about, I'm working something. It's not a humor campaign, quite the opposite. We'll launch it very soon. But I've been thinking a lot about all the ordinary Americans who are stepping forward to defy Trump. And so we're launching a campaign that focuses on those folks, the ordinary heroes there. And because, it's critical for people to see themselves
Right.
and to recognize just as fear is contagious, courage is contagious. And so we're really thinking about that. But also because one of the things that the right is trying to do, or or by being ignored by the major media to some extent, you're not getting a true picture of this resistance. And this resistance is so broad that if we show how broad it is, we're showing how many sectors are involved. It's not just a kind of a radical left thing. Like, this was considered, for example, one of the critiques that was made about Occupy. Occupy did a lot of great things. It raised a message about the billionaires, which is another message that we're talking about now. That message is one that resonates hugely with Americans. People really care about the corruption that's going on right now. They care hugely about the stealing of their private data. They care about their privacy. This crosses right, left, red, blue, purple. This is what people care about. They care about their bottom line economically, and what they know is not right, that somebody is gaining access to something that is theirs. But who delivers that message? So with Occupy, they had what was ultimately seen as a lot of mostly progressive lefty people. And, the critique, I mean, I wasn't as focused on it, but when I have read critiques by other people about why did it not translate into becoming a much more significant movement, it's because in some ways they didn't invite all the other Americans who care about that same issue. They didn't, for example, one example I was reading about that isn't that Blueprint for Book, or maybe it's somebody else. They were saying, they invited kind of lefty singers to sing to them rather than maybe inviting some country western singer with huge crossover appeal.
Right.
This is what I'm talking about. To me, it's like, you know, people who are, some of the people who have resisted Trump are people who are such law and order people. They voted for Trump. They're in the government, and suddenly he has crossed the line. And in a minute, they're like, no, I care more about the rule of law and I care more about Constitution than I won't do this thing that is illegal. That is. So I think values driven messaging and things like that. But thinking about who delivers your message is so important, and we know this. And so to some extent, there's always been this thing, whether you use humor or not, you do wanna think about who's the target and who's the messenger. And so to me, it gives you lots and lots of opportunities.
And you wanna make it something fun that people want to be a part of. I envision, some of these big protests, you know, like, let's make it a festival. Let's,
Right,
make it something that people, um, might wanna go to, not necessarily politically, because there's cool music and food trucks and whatever.
right.
We talk
I
a
mean, th
lot.
they had that at the end of I think the May 5th, I think. I can't remember what the demarches was. They hadn't organized speakers, and many of the people in that march, I was there at the end, I was doing some marshaling, and that people were arriving, and they were very disappointed to hear that there weren't speakers. They were just ready to do something else, and so basically the message the marshals were giving them was like, "You are now the messenger. You're now the speaker. You carry this message forward," which, is understandable, but they were just ready to do something else. They were like, "Give me direction, right? I'm
Right.
ready. Give me my marching orders." And that, as we're talking about, is what we need in terms of organizing and really harnessing mass movement. But what happened is that people didn't want to leave, and so what happened is it turned into a spontaneous party,
Right.
dance party. And, that's because that's where the energy was. It was a very festive energy. People felt energized. At the same time, you had both types of energy. And so I think, that's where organizing is important, and being able to judge like who is showing up. I learned a lot myself, a lot. I didn't start out as a very politically engaged person in my life. I was raised rather conservatively. And, I started out as a journalist, kind of observing things, but I got politicized by being in social movements where issues I cared about, and also because all my friends were doing it. There's no way I was gonna, as you say, miss the party.
Right.
So particularly for me, I really was very educated and learned how to do effective visual artivism when I was in ACT UP and around ACT UP. I covered it, but then I also watched it. And ACT UP was very useful because what they did was they said, "Listen, it's great to have a lot of different theories. It's great to have a lot of values, but what is the thing we're trying to do? Let's pick a clear target. Let's do something doable in the period of time we have to do it. And then let's think about the message we want to deliver and our target, and what are the ways in which to deliver that message." And so ACT UP was very good about creating very bold, very in your face, provocative graphic messages.
Mhm.
And it appealed to the people who they really needed to be with them, who are people who are, I mean, a lot of gay men, obviously, younger people who were terrified they were going to die. There was nothing for them to live. They were ready to take risks that maybe you wouldn't take unless you thought that you were going to be dying anyway. You had to do something. Maybe some people on the left feel that way right now with Trump. Certainly, people who are protesting around Gaza feel that way. We're despairing to see this situation that's happening in Gaza. It's just it's in our time, it's in our history, and it's very, very painful to feel like we can't do more to stop it. So I think that you have a set of people who are very angry and who may need expressions for that anger. So those kind of visuals do that. They express rage, fury, anger, etc. But then you also had a million examples that delivered the message in a humorous way. So one of them, for example, is some colleagues of mine. That cost a little bit of money, but they created a giant condom, and they dropped it over the house of Jesse Helms, who at the time was the Maine, North Carolina senator, who was opposed to HIV prevention and was saying that, uh, gay people were going to infect other people and bring the country down and all that. Well, that action was super successful. They did it with a crane. It took, stealth. It was fun. They did it. It was successful. And they also organized to make sure media was there. And then you saw that not that much longer after that, this ACT UP in Paris did the same thing, but they got Benetton, which was a private company, and they created a giant, enormous pink condom and dropped it on top of the Concorde, very high building, and it stayed up for quite a long time. It was extraordinary, and the French loved it
Right.
because it was humorous, it was pink, it was just everything about it. And they also spoke to their messaging was a lot of things around French liberty and equality, French sexuality, and things like that. So it just became, that for them, you can see how one group does something and then it gets adapted
Right.
differently, but it gets adapted, and so the French did it with a lot of humor because they already had the example of what had worked for the people in for New York City who went, North Carolina. To me, those are examples. Um, there's a few others, I ended up being a co-founder of this group that only was around for a couple of years, but it really started in some ways with a real cheekiness, a real desire to be funny, and it was called the Lesbian Avengers, and the name of it was chosen because the preceding decades of activism by women who identified as lesbians was sort of seen in the public eye as kind of dour and humorless. So we thought, let's work with that. And then tons of younger women were coming in and they had been in ACT UP, or they were just ready to have some fun and to be brave and whatever. So they ended up deciding that we wanted to have capes and be superheroes, which was just fun. I mean, I don't know that I would have chosen that, but it was about who was coming into the room and who was ready to do something. So you have to look and say, who's coming into the room? I may have my ideas, but what are they ready to do? And
Right.
what really a lot of people wanted to do is they wanted to express their sexiness. They wanted to express their sexuality. They wanted to be public. They wanted to take their shirts off. They wanted to just be bold in public. That is what they wanted. And they wanted that to be associated with a message of empowerment for women who identified as lesbian. And they also wanted to direct a message to the larger LGBT community, which was, you know, had a lot of sexism in it. And also, the emphasis had been so much around AIDS for good reason because men were much more affected. But of course, there were women who were affected, and women who were leaders in ACT UP. They were leading the response in many ways, but they felt like the health issues that were happening for women were overlooked. Whether it was monies for cancer and research, but also women just being institutionally at the helm of all these different kinds of structures. So there were so many things that were done, but from the very first action, it was meant to be disarming. So the very first action was handing out balloons that said, think I was a lesbian child at a meeting or at the first day of school when there was a very virulent right wing school board that was trying to pass very anti gay, well, you know, pass them, attempted to implement policies and kind of censorship, removing things like Heather has two mommies and these kinds of things from bookstores and things. So censorship, anti-visibility. And so, it was going that first day and handing out these balloons to parents coming into a school, which, was some parents didn't know what to do with it. Most parents laughed. And it was accompanied with song. The children, of course, loved the balloons. And it infuriated that particular group of people in, that particular group of right-wing people. It got media, but it also showed the lesbian gay movement that we are going to take on these kind of hoary stereotypes that are particularly directed against men, which are being pedophiles, being threats to children, etc. So take it right, bull by the horns. To me, that was a really good example of paying attention to how you wanted to use humor. What was the need to use humor? And then, there were a lot of different actions we did, but the one I really liked myself was, and this was because of what women wanted to do in our group, is that we pulled a giant bed down Fifth Avenue. We never got any permits to do anything. Giant bed just for lesbian romping. That's kind of like, and so people were, I think probably when I look back, the people who were new to activism, that's what they were thrilled to be visible,
Mhm.
to be out, to be unapologetic, to be having who they were associated with something fun, sexy, cheeky, unexpected, defiant, and different from what you usually saw in terms of major parades or marches going down Fifth Avenue. So those were very successful, and because we listened to what people wanted to do.
Right. Um, so anybody out there, if you wanna, write some questions in the chat, we can answer some. Um, we've been talking a lot about how do you talk about politics without talking about politics, and I think some of what you're describing is that some of it's a little bit more niche, but I think we're always looking for ways to take the zeitgeist and figure out how do people talk about their values without necessarily being super in your face on politics, because there's a large portion of Americans who want to not pay attention. They want to be able to insulate themselves, and you can't, because,
Yeah. Well, I mean,
politics will come for you, but find a way that they can absorb values without necessarily having to make a political statement.
I think the reframing the narrative is probably the one big message I would say that is consistent with most of these actions. It is really when once an authoritarian regime or an autocrat has gained control of, to some extent, the institutions, whether they're, to some extent they have a majority of support of the parliament, they're able to pass things, and it doesn't seem like you can stop them. The court of public opinion and propaganda is the place where you really necessarily need to be acting as much as possible, and it also gives you many, many, many avenues for expressing yourself that don't require you to necessarily have an army of people. You can be a single person, a small group, a larger group, whatever. Um, but I think that particularly it works because humor is that like I say, it is disarming. It immediately reframes the focus, and it's something that crosses all politics to some extent. Things are funny. This is why Barack was such a hit. Um, but I think that things like that are important. At the same time, there are things to be watching for that can make it less successful. We can talk about that. But I just want if you have people who are asking questions, then I'll stop and we'll see.
All right. Anybody have any questions you want to write in the chat for either of us? We do talk a lot about reframing the message. I talked to Antonia Scatton recently. I always love hearing from and talking to Anat Shenker-Osorio, and just had a conversation with Aviv Russ, who is a storyteller. Um, and I found this humor was sort of another way to reframe the narrative.
Yeah.
With these projections in Boston, but also, have you seen other things that, have piqued your interest in recent times in the United States that?
Right. Well, I think there are a lot of different things. I mean, certainly people know that even though they didn't necessarily win, that certainly all of the women who have been dressing up as handmaids Handmaid's Tales, those are always successful because they just deliver an immediate message. There's enough of a reference to what that means for people to understand that we're afraid that that's where we're going, or that we have things to say about where we're going. Those are good. I'm trying to think about the U.S., what I have seen lately. Hmm. Um, I mean, lots of different types of examples. When there were the examples of what was happening around fighting against the what do you call it? The Sackler. I don't know if you know the Sackler, which was a health activists, people who work in the field of harm reduction and addiction, were protesting the money that the Sackler family, a rich family, had given to museums and other institutions, having their name put on these buildings when they were associated with having used that money to basically uh, privilege or favor the use of certain opiates long after it was seen that these were very dangerous and were essentially contributing to extending this very deadly epidemic. And so opiates. And so there were a lot of actions that were done, but one of them I liked was one in, I think it was the Met, could be wrong about that, the Met or Museum of Modern Art, where they had these activists went and they essentially filled up the pools within the museum with little pill bottles. Things that, and it became an art statement. It became very an artistic thing. And then they talked about the art. It was smart. Uh, you had to look at it. You couldn't look away, and it was effective. So it related to like where they were, what they were saying of, and of course, as you know, they didn't win in all the legal cases with Sackler, but they did succeed in removing names from most of the buildings. So they succeeded. They had a very concrete objective. We are not going to tolerate these people being rewarded with this kind of visibility as if they're good stewards when this is what they have been responsible for. So it's important to have that narrow message. And I mention this because, there's a level of criticism that's been done lately against a group in Europe. It's in London called Femin. And these are women, mostly younger women, who have really become quite famous for taking their shirts off. And they have amazing bodies, so more power to them. But, and that they want, that they're comfortable doing that. And of course, it always gets attention. And so for someone like me, it's like I'm such an old school feminist. I'm like, oh, really? Because I don't want that. I hate, giving such power to the male gaze, whether you're reclaiming it or not. But, they had levels of success. And at first they were doing things around abortion and reproductive health and stuff like that. And for a while, it was very successful when they picked certain topics. But then after a while, the critique of that, which, I'm sure they'll have things to say. So I'm not criticizing them. I'm just observing what other people are saying about that, is that they began to be associated with like every cause.
Mm,
So suddenly, like, you think of feminine, you think, okay, boobs, okay, you think bold, but then you're not sure what is the thing they're trying to change. And I think it's very important to keep focused on your targets and
right.
messaging. And I think that that's where people are concerned to some extent about, okay, we have a resistance movement now. It's like every issue under the sun. How are we going to harness this? And my feeling is I'm less worried, first of all, because I have seen successful groups who have learned to have very decentralized organizing with clear focus.
Right.
So, as an example, in Poland, they had a women's strike where it was started by young women, and it was in response to an egregious abortion law, anti-abortion law, like one of the worst anyway. Like really, they didn't, women could be dying of whatever, and they were like, yeah, we're still going to ban this. And so they organized in a way that was in small groups in small cities. And they didn't necessarily create this big national thing. They wasn't prescriptive. They agreed on a few points, but those groups were very free to organize. So they focused very much on local organizing, and they ended up bringing in the remnants of this labor movement. It wasn't a remnants, I mean, they're active, but mean in an organized way of the kind of Lech Walesa movement. And these were obviously a lot of women, but a lot of guys who never had really made feminism the core part of their labor movement.
Right.
And to the point where they were so successful in making their arguments that they ended up having first of all, they defeated the law, and they did it with, strategically applying different kinds of things, including some health strategies from labor movement. But they ended up with a movement that represented bodily autonomy, LGBTQ rights, and some health rights that the labor movement cared about as a national platform.
Right.
And they won the national elections, and they used the structure that they had used to organize. Now, all of that takes work and things, but my point is that they created a decentralized structure that reflected kind of the level of local political infrastructure that they already had.
Right.
And they were a small group of relatively young and not hyper experienced political organizers.
Right.
And they quickly realized that to succeed, they needed to hold on to and bring the leadership that they had. They needed to own that leadership, but they had to invite people who were being impacted by this. And that's why I think, the lesson for us is, let's think of our targets. I'm hoping that we will come to the point where we have a 2, 3, 4 priority targets for what we really want and demand
Right.
around our goals for the Trump administration. But to succeed, a lot of people are saying it has to be a movement. We need a leader. And I was like, no, we don't. Actually, that's not at all what we have. You have to work from what you have. And
Right.
what we have is a very decentralized movement. People haven't even learned to work together. You have entirely new people like the 50501s coming from the real radical left. You have established groups like Move On and Indivisible. They haven't worked together. They don't necessarily know how to trust each other yet. But if you create opportunities for collaboration, then you see that happen. That can happen. So, you know, I feel quite optimistic with the number of people coming forward. And if we create structures that let people take agency from wherever they are, like you, me, whoever, and we can identify with and be a part of that, then you will have much more success. So,
We had
yeah.
we had a question about how to bring more of the multicultural community aspect into this. Do you have any thoughts? I mean, I think right now a lot of who we see out there are, older white people, because a lot of the Black community and other pieces of, other parts of the community are like, we've been doing this. It's your turn now. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. Well, first of all, I mean, when I said radical left, somebody make a note saying 5051 is radical left. I'm actually using some of the members of 501 who consider themselves that way. So I apologize for speaking for that group. I'm not. But there are groups who view themselves that way. But it's a much broader set of people. And locally, it has different a different portrait depending whether you're in New York or wherever you are. The 50501 is again kind of who has shown up. Um, but yes, I think that first of all,
And
I
men
think
too.
that yeah, I think that we have a lot of learning to do from the Black Lives Matter movement and how they led and what their demands were around white solidarity. So if we are now in joining in these kind of anti-resistance, we can already look to that kind of leadership. That leadership isn't it's still there. It still is active for us, and also to be really recognizing that there's some areas where we haven't necessarily raised the conversation, which we absolutely need to. Fundamentally, Trumpism or the agenda of Project 2025 is a white supremacy movement and everything in it. I mean, DEI is just really a synonym for racism. That's what it's about. That is what it's designed to do. Everything and even the immigration, attacks. What is its goal? Its goal is to remove tons and tons of people from being able to vote. That
Right.
is the mid game and the long game. And we haven't elevated that conversation enough to me. So that's something that we can already do. Secondly, it's to really recognize that there are certain pieces of this agenda we need to be making more noise about. Like, when we talk about DEI, let's name it. Let's talk about what it means to remove history. Let's talk about the fact that when you remove people from history and, people's accomplishments from your contemporary history, you're not just making them invisible or making them invisible for the future. You're removing and you're changing the story of America. And we need to claim that story and make it very, very clear. So there's a lot of things we could be doing in our movement now that are about addressing the real concerns of people who have been, leaders, whether they're in Black Lives Matter or other groups. And I also think that, first of all, some of my friends participate in these and want to, but it is a it, it's just there's such a grotesque constant attack happening against people of color in this country and all the folks who are immigrants. I mean, I've been blown away by people who are immigrants who are turning up, given the fact that it is so dangerous for them. But I'll give you an example of what I think is a positive way this is being done. So it's not necessarily just around race, but I just wrote today in our Substack, or maybe yesterday, about in Brighton Beach is having a pride. And Brighton Beach is a community that has a lot of immigrants always historically. It's very conservative as well. And there are a lot of Trump voters there. But they have had I guess they're on year 9 of a small but always very celebratory pride that was organized by a Russian led or Ukrainian led group on behalf of mostly Russian LGBT immigrants, also from the Caucasus and Central Asia, and things are too dangerous. So the organizer decided that they cannot invite their people and they're not going to give up on that event. But they're telling people, if you are not a citizen and you don't have your green card, please do not come. We cannot assure your safety.
Right.
And at the same time, they put out a call to all the rest of New York to say, show your solidarity, be here for this, come and show these people who are now in a new underground, terrified, that they're not alone and that you are going to be able to speak for them and on their behalf, directed by them on their behalf. So I think that's an example of where you can do solidarity. So if people are wondering, like, how do I do solidarity? I always say, why don't you go and ask the people that you're wondering what they think about what they would like to see happen?
Right.
Because they will tell you. They're very clear about what they know needs to happen. So to me, those are the ways in which you begin doing that kind of solidarity. And you can certainly be representing the voices of people of color, whether or not they're at the heads of those marches, because you're aware of the importance of that and the necessity of that. So to me, there's lots of ways of doing that.
Wow. Well, I think we covered so much. And I thank you so much for your time. I want to keep exploring, ways that, all the different ways. My general reason for being at this point is finding a way that we can have our voices heard. And, there's so, they're throwing the fire hose, and that's not a good way to do that. I totally broke that metaphor. But there's always so much going on, and we need to find a way to rise above the noise. And I think some of these things uh, will do that. We just have to keep remembering to um, to be creative
Yeah.
and to be thoughtful and to use all the different pieces of what drives humans.
Yeah.
And
But I think also
perfect.
it's very important to have a perspective on where you are at a particular moment and what is the lens you're doing to judge your success. So you may lose a battle and, win something else. I mean, you have to really think about all the ways in which you might measure your success even before you do an action, to think about that.
Mhm.
What is the thing that I'm seeking to do? How am I going
Right.
to evaluate if I was successful? I mean, to me, one of the biggest successes of the mass mobilization is that people are stepping out of their doors and they want to participate. That's tremendous. And there's lots of things that are happening. We don't know what happens when they go home. I've heard lots and lots of examples of people who go to their neighbors' houses and bring their neighbor to the next one. These are good examples of where mobilization's happening, but there are so many ways. So it's critical for us to understand that even when you may have, it's happening at many, many levels, that impact. It's not just happening at one level. And that people are borrowing from each other. So to me, it's like I do point people to resources that I think are important. So, for example, there are, I think that in we did the Substack that you're talking about, which I think is called something like, I can't even remember what it's called. Something like, you know, I don't know. What was it called? Resist something. It was about martial law. Like, don't wait for martial law, take
Yeah.
action. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. The 3 R's. That one had a set of resources at the end of it that included one website that has, I don't know, 180 examples of actions taken by groups around the world in different social justice movements and analyzes them, many of them using humor or other forms of protest. So I suggest that people look at those and learn from them because there's a lot to be learned,
Right. So
and
that
people are sharing those.
for anybody watching was on April 20th. And it was stop waiting for martial law and apply the 3 R's of nonviolent protest:
Right,
refuse, resist, and ridicule.
right,
And that's actually what got my attention.
right. Okay,
And I contacted you. So,
yeah,
um,
yeah. There's some resources in that you can go to learn much more. Um, And also, I think it's very important, talk to the people. I always think it's great to have a small group that you can talk to me and saying, what are ideas? What are the creatives you have? Think out of the box
mhm,
in those ways. And I think it's more important to kind of also address like what helps people overcome their fears of things, to take actions that they can take and not to expect people that, not everyone is going to always be able to do all those things. So how can you create actions where people can come in at different levels? Where they can take their next step from where they are, and like for us, it was people jumping up and down on a bed, and then eventually they were like, putting themselves down on the street and engaging in civil disobedience and things. But I think that's the organizing part is important, and to learn about that. And I think also in my circle, Rise and Resist are among the groups who are pulling together resources. A lot of people are coming together who are really training, who are very skilled in training. So I also encourage people to participate in those, sign up and do those things, and benefit from what other people have done and learning what has been effective for them in their different movements.
I think that's great advice. And so we'll keep our eye on that, and we'll keep in touch. And um, for anybody on here, I'm going to put up um, the recording. So invite your friends to look at it as soon as I can get it up. But I wanted to thank you, and Christine,
Absolutely.
it was a wonderful conversation, and
Yeah.
thank all of you who joined us for this first. It was good to have
Right.
people actually show up to the first thing. And is
Yeah.
there anything, the last thing you want to do to point people to where they
I
can?
do. I would say one last thing is that authoritarians do not last. Putin has been in there, but he will not last. So the more that we focus on, I mean, it's critical to focus on stopping Trump, but it's equally critical to be focusing on like what really matters is what we do about this. That is what is going to make the difference about whether or not we have the kind of democracy or working toward it that we have not yet had that we care about. So it's an opportunity. So it's critical to sort of look at it that way. The ones that are really successful, the ones who focused on rebuilding their democracy as they fought. So to me,
Right.
that's what I focus on. I'm looking for everything that is of interest to me. It's exhilarating as it's depressing. This is an incredible moment, and we have so much that we're going to do. Ultimately, I'm always an optimist because I've looked back and seen what has worked. That doesn't mean that we're not going to be living through the incredible shit that we're seeing right now. And, you know, crying ourselves, at night to see what's happening in places like Gaza, etc. But we will we will prevail in these wars. I mean, I'm sure of it, but we have to be focused on our values and always speaking from that place to me.
All right. Just one last comment from one of our people. Holy moly, American chose a pope in the face of the what? Oh, apparently they chose a pope. Okay. I'll go look and find out what the news is. Thank you so much, and I look forward
Yes.
to being in contact. And thank you
All
all
right.
for joining us.
Thanks so much.